there's a moment most of us know too well. The one where you look at a goal so big, it feels almost embarrassing to say out loud. And a quiet voice inside whispers that people like you don't do things like that. Maybe it's a career change you've been circling for years, a fitness goal you keep starting on a Monday and abandoning by Thursday, a business idea scribbled in the notes app of your phone, or simply the ache to feel alive again instead of just getting through another identical week. That whisper, the one that says not possible for someone like me, quiet but relentless, is exactly the voice Nirmal Purja spent his entire life arguing with, loudly, patiently, and eventually with his own two frostbitten hands. And in his memoir, Beyond Possible, he doesn't just tell us he silenced it, he shows us step by frozen step exactly what it costs and exactly what it gives back in return. Purja was a working-class kid from a small town in Nepal, the son of a former Gurkha soldier who grew up watching his family scrape together a living while dreaming of something larger than the circumstances he was born into. He joined the British Gurkhas, then pushed his way into the UK Special Forces, becoming one of the first Gurkhas ever to do so. A selection process so grueling that most candidates simply quit long before it ever tests their bodies, because it is designed first and foremost to break the mind. Purja passed it not because he was the strongest recruit in the room, but because he had already decided, quietly and privately, that quitting simply wasn't an option he was willing to consider, and that decision, made long before any mountain entered the picture, turned out to be the real foundation of everything that came after. And somewhere along that unlikely path, years later he found himself standing at the base of the world's 14 highest mountains, the so-called 8,000ers, the most brutal, oxygen-starved peaks found on Earth itself, deciding he would climb every single one of them in under 7 months. To put that into perspective, the previous world record for climbing all 14 stood at nearly 8 years, set by a seasoned professional climber with decades of experience and sponsorship behind him. Purja had neither the fame nor the funding, nor, according to almost everyone around him, the pedigree or the credibility to even attempt it. And yet, he did it anyway, calling the project Project Possible, a name that almost feels like a direct rebuttal to every doubter he'd ever encountered. On the surface, this reads like an extraordinary athletic feat, a story reserved for adrenaline junkies and hardened mountaineering enthusiasts, something to admire from a safe, comfortable distance, and then quietly forget by the time you've finished your coffee. But underneath it lies something far more universal, far more useful to anyone listening right now. Whether you will ever strap on crampons or not, whether you've ever even seen snow, whether the closest you've come to a death zone is a stressful Monday morning meeting. Because Purja's real subject isn't altitude, it's the architecture of belief, and how ordinary human beings quietly convince themselves of impossible ceilings long before reality ever actually tests them. That is precisely why this book still matters in a world full of comfortable chairs, endless notifications, and quietly diminished expectations. Because the mountain in his story is really a metaphor for whatever it is you've decided, without ever truly testing it, is simply out of your league. His life stands as proof that the ceiling is usually installed by our own minds, brick by invisible brick, long before the world ever gets a chance to tell us no. And it is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, because most of us were never actually rejected by the world in any formal sense. We simply stopped applying, stopped asking, stopped raising our hands, long before anyone in a position of authority ever had the chance to say no to our faces. Purja's story is uncomfortable, precisely because it removes that excuse. It strips away the comfortable idea that Circumstance alone decides who gets to attempt something extraordinary and replaces it with a far more demanding, far more empowering truth that the attempt itself was always available to us. We simply never gave ourselves permission to make it. And maybe that's the strangest comfort in all of this. The realization that the very thing holding you back from your own version of a summit was never really the mountain at all. It was the quiet, unquestioned story you'd been telling yourself about. Who gets to attempt it? And Purja's entire life is a patient, breathless argument against that story. One frozen ridge and one impossible deadline at a time. And by the time you finish listening to this, you might just find yourself quietly questioning which of your own ceilings was ever really as solid as it once seemed. The heart of Beyond Possible isn't really a list of climbing achievements. It's a handful of lessons that Purja lived through frostbite and exhaustion, rather than lectured from a stage, and they translate into ordinary life with almost no adjustment needed. The first lesson is that clarity beats motivation every time, because motivation is fickle and weather-dependent. It shows up on good days and vanishes the moment things get uncomfortable. But a clear, almost stubborn vision of what you're building and why keeps you moving when your hands are numb, and every rational part of your brain is quietly begging you to turn back. For the rest of us, that might look like writing down, in plain language, exactly why a goal matters to you at 3 in the morning when doubt creeps in, so you have something solid to hold on to instead of relying on fleeting bursts of willpower. The second lesson is that fear is data, not a stop sign. Purja describes standing on knife-edge ridgelines in the death zone, where one wrong step meant falling thousands of feet. Yet he trained himself to let that fear sharpen his focus rather than freeze his feet, treating it as information about how much a moment mattered rather than a signal to retreat. This mirrors what any of us feel before a hard conversation, a big presentation, or a risky decision. That shaking your hands isn't telling you to quit. It's confirming you're standing exactly where growth lives. The third lesson is the quiet power of preparation meeting audacity, because before Purja ever dreamed of breaking records, he trained for years, studying weather systems, oxygen logistics, and route planning with the discipline of an engineer. And only once that foundation was solid did he allow himself to reach for something extraordinary. That's a formula anyone can borrow. Do the unglamorous groundwork first, so competence becomes the floor beneath bold ambition, rather than letting ambition become reckless hope with nothing underneath it. The fourth lesson, maybe the most touching one, is that no summit is truly climbed alone. Purja built a tight-knit team, shared his own oxygen with climbers in danger, and carried exhausted strangers down the mountain, constantly crediting his fellow Sherpa climbers as equal heroes rather than support staff. It's a reminder that even the most individual-looking achievements are almost always the result of people who showed up for each other. So the modern equivalent is simple. Invest in the people around you, because they're the reason you'll still be standing when you reach whatever peak you're climbing. The fifth lesson is redefining your identity. Before you redefine your results, Purja didn't wait for fame to arrive before seeing himself as someone capable of greatness. He decided that identity first and spent years closing the gap between who he believed he was and what the world could finally see. A subtle but radical idea that self-belief isn't the reward at the end of the journey. It's the engine that starts it moving. Practically, this means the person contemplating a career switch at 40, the exhausted parent trying to reclaim their health, or the student who feels invisible in a crowded field can all borrow the same blueprint. Get clear on your reason, treat fear as information rather than a warning. Quietly prepare before you loudly announce anything. Surround yourself with people who will carry you when you're running on empty. And start acting today like the person you're still trying to become, instead of waiting for permission. By the time Purja stands on that last summit, breathless and transformed, The story stops being about mountains altogether. It becomes a quiet mirror held up to everyone who has ever underestimated themselves. And if his story does one thing, let it plant a small, stubborn seed of a thought that maybe your own impossible isn't as fixed as you've always assumed. And if that seed takes root, the richest way to let it grow is to sit down with beyond possible in his own words, because some stories, much like some mountains, are simply meant to be climbed slowly, one page and one breath at a time.